Hey everybody, welcome back to another reading of the Municipalists by Seth. When I came to, my hands were tied to the leg of the cause with the belt of Laurie's robe. My nose throbbed and my face was sticky with dry blood and lemonade. Laurie was standing next to an open control panel on the wall, speaking into a red telephone. After she hung up, a high-pitched tone rang out over the train's PA system, interrupted by a man's voice saying, "Comprende." The train increased in speed. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, Laurie was standing over me, dressed in blue jeans, a t-shirt, a pair of sneakers, and a light twill jacket. She had a brown messenger bag slung over one shoulder. In her right hand, she held a small black taser. "Miss Laurie," I said, "we have to get you back to your family." I'm taking you to see them now," she said, then leaned down to tase me gingerly in the neck. My legs were still twitching when the train slowed to a stop. Two men entered the car and began to confer with her in Esperanto. She gave what sounded like careful instructions, and the two untied me and lifted me to my feet. One of them took out a zip-tie restraint and told me to hold out my hands. I nodded slowly and listened for any sign of Owen in my ear. He was silent. "Are you there?" I risked asking out loud, my voice catching at the knowledge I was alone. The men looked at each other confused. One of them said again, "Your hands." "Okay," I said. "I'll cooperate. I'm cooperating." I bolted down the car and almost made it to the garden path before one of the men grabbed me by the neck of my blazer and pulled me back. He and his partner took turns punching me in the stomach, then held my hands behind my back long enough to slip on the restraint. The four of us marched back through the train. In the other cars, dozens of agents were busy tearing down its interior. Men in black suits and safety goggles were taking sledgehammers to dividing walls, while others were busy carrying out furniture and stacks of garment bags. As we passed through the library, Laurie grabbed her diary and tucked it into the side pocket of her bag. She removed the print of Boadicea from the wall and kissed it before placing it in the same pocket. We exited out the rear of the train, Laurie jumping nimbly down into the tunnel while I had to be lowered by both arms. One of Kirkland's men keeping a grip on the collar of my jacket. As he climbed down to keep me from making a run for it, from the looks of the aging brickwork, the train had stopped at one of the city's abandoned stations. The place was dark except for a dozen portable lights humming on the platform where Kirkland's agents were busy loading Laurie's possessions into Canva's hand carts. I wasn't able to see any indication of the station's name and could only make out some of the faded mosaics with their complex geometrical patterns repeating until they disappeared in the dark. In the middle of all the activity on the platform was a woman wearing a black agency suit. Rather than the tailored blazer and skirt favored by most of the female agents in Suitland, she was wearing the men's cut. Her hair was in a long, dark braid that fell over her right shoulder, and she was holding a clipboard. She observed the men's progress and occasionally told her subordinates where to set a piece of furniture or one of the garden's flower beds as everything was carried off the train. Laurie called up to the woman, who waved in our direction and continued to issue orders to the men as she approached us. Once she was closer, I was surprised to recognize her as Helen Roth, a brilliant economist who I'd seen present a paper on economic diversity at the 2011 Civic Dynamics Summit in Minneapolis. Her ideas on how to nurture and sustain local businesses in struggling areas had inspired me to propose several development programs of my own. She was young for her accomplishments and rather pretty. When she smiled down at Laurie, I saw that she still had the charming gap in her front teeth, which I took to mean that the denture treatment was reserved for Kirkland's lower-level enforcers. Back in 2011, I had approached her after her talk in order to thank her for sharing her insights. She had smiled warmly and even seemed impressed when I introduced myself as an agent with the USMS. Looking back, I had often been disappointed in myself that I hadn't screwed up the courage to ask if I could buy her a drink. But if she recognized me as I was, standing in the dark with my face bloodied, she did nothing to indicate it. She gestured down the tunnel and offered a word of either warning or encouragement to Laurie before tossing her a flashlight. Laurie thanked her and pointed the light down the tunnel as she began to walk. The man to my left elbowed me, making me understand that we were to follow. We worked our way through a system of dead tunnels that Laurie seemed to know by heart. The air was damp and filled with a reek of mold that made it hard to breathe. The tracks themselves ran perfectly straight, but she led us through a dizzying progression of access tunnels and abandoned stairways. Even if I had known what station we had departed from, it was impossible to tell if we were moving deeper into the tunnels or doubling back. If we were on our way up to the surface or winding farther and farther down, after some time we came upon a set of tracks that were the narrower 3 feet gauge that hadn't been used in over 80 years. Lori turned off her flashlight, revealing a faint, slowly flashing red light at the far end of the tunnel. As we moved toward it, I saw the light was coming from a high fixture on a brick wall. There was a heavy security door in the middle with a keypad over the handle. Lori entered the code and pulled the door open, flooding the tunnel with light. My eyes were still adjusting as I was pushed through the door. The space was filled with the din of many people hard at work, and I was eventually able to make out a large bullpen of desks under a high white ceiling. Men and women in identical black suits were gathered around large computer monitors and dry erase boards, handing printouts back and forth and calling out to one another in Esperanto. As I was led around the bullpen by Lori and the two men, I passed a series of classrooms where Kirkland's agents sat at school desks, loudly reciting phrases in Esperanto. It was difficult to tell if their booming recitations were grammar exercises or loyalty oaths, until I heard an instructor call out enthusiastically, "Jes Tree Bona." From another room I heard the sound of someone groaning in pain, while just outside a young woman with bandaged fingers sat flipping through a magazine under a sign that read, "Dentisto." I was led into a long corridor with windows looking out onto firing ranges where men and women were shooting handguns and rifles at moving targets. The glass was soundproof and the flashes of gunfire were noiseless. We passed windows looking in on large gymnasiums where people were rappelling from the ceiling while down below others practiced hand-to-hand combat. One particularly troubling room contained a group of men hollering to one another as they used flamethrowers to attack a replica of a National Guard truck. They stood in a half-circle spraying its cab with flames. 50 yards away, a man hoisted an RPG onto his shoulder, then shouted something to the others, who scattered. The bed of the truck, I noticed, was loaded with 24 mannequins, all dressed in fatigues. We turned into a small passageway with a series of windowless doors. Lori picked one seemingly at random and punched in the code to open it. Inside was a small closet filled with cleaning supplies and a few pieces of office furniture. She nodded, and the two men pushed me inside. They forced me into an office chair and tied me to it with some extension cords they found on a shelf. "You'll have to forgive us," Lori said, as one of the men made a final knot in the cords around my chest. "As you've seen on the news, we're not really in the habit of taking prisoners, but Terry wants to see you before you're dealt with, so this will have to do." The men filed out of the room and stood behind her. "Anyway," she said, pulling the door shut, "you won't be with us long." The door locked itself with a buzz, and I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours. There was little to accompany me in that time, except for the throb in my nose and a general sense of dread. It was with no small sense of relief that I greeted the sound of a distant crackle in my ear, followed by a bright spotlight shining out from between the gaps in the extension cords cinched across my chest. Owen stepped into the spotlight, looking a little distorted. "Did you save the day?" he said. "Did I miss it?" Before I could answer, he approached me and began examining my face. "What happened here?" "I was beaten up." Owen shook his head, not even trying to hide his disappointment. "Let me get a better look at you," he said, leaning in closer. He seemed pleasantly surprised by the degree of my injuries. "Hey, you look horrible." "You don't say. You're a mess. Isn't that great? You'll have to walk me through it." "My patch," he said. "I made some adjustments when I was rebooting back in Suitland. It must finally be working. Now I can see you get injured and it won't bother me." "I'm happy for you," I said. "Really? Because you look miserable." Deciding it might be more productive to change the subject, I gave Owen a rundown of everything that had happened since he fainted. He seemed almost impressed with how quickly our plan had deteriorated in his absence. "Owen, they're going to kill me." "What?" "Oh, no. Don't worry about that," Owen said before adding, "Well, I mean, yes, they probably are planning to kill you at some point. But according to you, Lori said Kirkland wants to talk first. That's an amazing opportunity to gather intelligence. We can't even think of escaping before then." I was about to protest, but the door buzzed again and began to open. Owen winked as he disappeared. A young woman entered the room, pushing a handcart. She had a bleached pixie cut and was wearing a black jumpsuit. On her neck there was a tattoo of a gas mask. Behind her was a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a matching jumpsuit. He was holding a bucket and a handgun. The woman stepped to one side and waited without expression while the man put the bucket on the ground and pointed his gun at me. He nudged the bucket toward me with his foot, and there was the sound of water sloshing inside. "This will only take a minute," he said, "and if you're thinking of turning into a giant clown or a thing with wings, I'm going to start shooting at anything that moves. Understand?" I nodded and he placed the handgun in the canvas belt of his jumpsuit. He retrieved a butterfly knife from his pocket and cut through the extension cords and the restraint around my wrists. Then he took a towel from the cart and tossed it onto my lap, telling me to wash up and get undressed. While I wiped the blood from my face, I noticed a handheld metal detector sitting on the cart. Sarah Laurie's description of Owen's projections must have reminded Kirkland's people of our run-in at the museum, so now they were on the lookout for some technology. Owen must have spotted the metal detector even before I did. When I went to pull off the clip tie, he'd already camouflaged it to my tie. I managed to slide it onto the second knuckle of my pinky finger, where it camouflaged itself again. Once I'd taken off my clothes, the man pulled out a tape measure and started taking my measurements, calling them out to the woman as he did so. Meanwhile, she was busy placing my individual articles of clothing into plastic evidence bags. She made sure each bag was sealed before picking it up and waving the metal detector over it. My wristwatch and belt buckle both elected sustained beeps, and she frowned as if this might be significant, making notations on their respective bags with a red marker. Just to be safe, she also ripped off the heels of my shoe before bagging them, and used a penknife to cut out the linings of my blazer. When the man was finished with the measurements, he grabbed the metal detector and told me to hold out my arms, as he started to wave the device over me. I flicked the tie clip off my finger and coughed to cover the sound of it pinging against the cement floor. "Hold still," he said. He moved the wand slowly over my body before clicking it off and tossing it back onto the cart. "All right, he's clean." He gathered up a pile of fresh clothes his partner had placed on the cart and handed them to me. "Put this on." It was a black suit just like the ones Kirkland's agents wore. When I was dressed, the man removed an adhesive bandage from his pocket and applied it carefully to the wound on my nose. He straightened my tie and looked me up and down. He smiled approvingly, then punched me in the stomach and shoved me back into my chair. The two left, and Owen sprang up out of darkness. "This is perfect," he said. "Kirkland's going to interrogate you, which will finally give us some evidence to relay to the authorities. Then we escape, save Metropolis, and return to Suitland as heroes. And on top of all that, you'll be walking out of here with a brand new suit. Not bad." I grabbed the clip off the floor and slid it back onto my tie, where it became invisible against the black silk. I was trying to come around to Owen's optimistic point of view when he suddenly vanished and the door opened again. A man holding an assault rifle ordered me out into the hallway. There was a whole tactical assault team standing behind him. "This is so flattering," Owen said in my ear as I exited the room. "Look how many guns they brought." One of the men put a bag over my head, and I was walked through more tunnels and up stairways. The air grew colder, and our footsteps began to echo until eventually I heard the sound of a grate being lifted, and I felt someone pull me into the open air. When the bag was removed, we were in a fenced-off lot filled with construction equipment. Among the dump trucks and the backhoes were dozens of large items covered in canvas drop cloths that looked an awful lot like artillery guns. I stared up at them until one of the men jabbed me in the back with the muzzle of his gun and told me to start walking. 4 more of Kirkland's men were waiting for us outside the lot. They weren't holding weapons, but it was easy enough to spot the bulges under their jackets. The men with the rifles exchanged a few words with them in Esperanto as they handed me off, then fell back. That'll be it for this part. I hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.